I realized last night that this is my 10th NACIS. Well, that's kind of exciting. So today I'm talking about climate change, maps, and the media. And I wanted to start off talking about this concept of maps that matter. So the agenda article that Amy just presented on was in a series of 5 articles about envisioning the future of cartographic research. And in 2 of the 5 articles, they talk about maps that matter as maps that should raise interest, be engaging, understandable, and relevant to society. So I'm looking at the kind of climate change as a case study for maps that matter. And I think it's a good case study for this because it's kind of the poster child for scientific communication by the media. And it's a topic that's contentious. It's inherently geographic, so we can map it. It's difficult to understand, so we need to use maps to make it understandable, and of course, it's relevant to society. So there's a lot of different things that we can map of climate change. I've been kind of characterizing this to myself as kind of first-order effects, so warming temperature, precipitation changes, second-order effects, which might be glacial melt, sea ice loss, sea level rise, vegetation impacts, and then kind of third-order impacts, which might be habitat loss or impacts on people like climate refugees. And then in the bottom corner, I have causes, so carbon emissions, methane emissions, that kind of thing. And this is not an exhaustive list at all, but just trying to show you the wealth of different things that we can map as cartographers related to climate change. So I wanted to draw your attention to a review paper by Harold et al., who they are cognitive scientists who kind of put together some guidelines for creating accessible climate graphics. So these are not necessarily maps, and they only kind of mention maps in their study, but graphics need to direct attention. They have to make important features perceptually salient, so we've studied that in cartography. They need to reduce complexity, so create visual chunks, so that would be what Alex Tate and Bill Impasathian were talking about yesterday related to Gestalt. They need to include only necessary information, and then of course they need to support inference making, so they need to make climate change understandable to you, and to do that, they need to show inferences directly on the graphic. They need to kind of allow you as the reader to just understand and get right to what you need to get out of the graphic. They need to direct readers to important relationships and then use metaphors that people understand to aid in conceptual thinking. So this is kind of a set of research questions that I have for this portion of my dissertation research. So this is only kind of 1/3 of my dissertation research, but the research questions that I'm trying to get at in this research was that I'm looking at what design decisions do media and public communication cartographers make when creating maps of climate change. How do they make this complex issue into something that's understandable to a wide audience? How do cartographers work with scientists to create compelling climate change stories for public consumption? What cartographic designs do map makers use to make climate change tangible? So how do they make this big issue tangible to us? So over the summer at the ICC, I presented on the first part of my dissertation research, which was a content analysis of several hundred maps of climate change. And in those, the majority of maps were actually from peer-reviewed articles. So somebody at a media organization looks through these peer-reviewed articles and takes a graphic and sticks it in. And those are usually at media organizations that don't have the resources to employ cartographers or graphics, kind of a graphics desk. However, I wanted to focus on really the ones on the left-hand side of this slide, which are at NASA, National Geographic, the New York Times, and NOAA. They're kind of producing the most amount of graphics in-house at their places of work. So this research was 12 interviews that I conducted at those 4 places, and these were my interview participants who were very gracious in talking to me for 30 minutes to 60 minutes to answer all of my questions that I had in my interviews. And these are cartographers, they're graphic editors, science writers, team leads at outreach and communication efforts within various agencies and media organizations. So through my research, a common theme was that there's a similar design process. So cartographers kind of start with ideas, and they have, then they go and do some initial research, then they contact scientists and really have engaging conversations with those folks, and then distill the information into a meaningful map or story, and then that gets published. And obviously, sometimes this is an iterative process. This isn't necessarily linear, but those steps are kind of all part of it, and they kind of need to go through all 4 of those to get to a publication state. Okay, so in the ideas, where did these ideas come from? So many of the ideas come from major peer-reviewed articles. They're published in high-impact journals, think Science, Nature, PNAS. These folks are looking at this research to get ideas on what they want to make maps of. Sometimes it's reactions to the news. So, for instance, when the U.S. pulled out of the Paris Agreement, there were a lot of maps that came out right around that time of kind of the implications of that, or showing kind of implications of that. Sometimes it's a cool data set that's under embargo. So the New York Times talked a lot about this. And sometimes they get really cool data sets that some scientist comes to them with and is like, we want you to do something with this, and what can you do? One of the main questions that generally these folks all talked about was they can only kind of show it in a map if it affects people. So something that's really remote, maybe in northern Canada, is a little less likely to be shown in a map than something in, say, the southeast US. So initial research. So I found this to be really interesting. So this is Lauren Tierney at National Geographic, and she said, if I'm selected for a story, that's when I start initial research. She does a Google search, she checks recent news articles on the topic, and then she goes through Google Scholar and she's reading these articles. So these folks are not just kind of talking to scientists and then writing up a quote. They're really going and digging into what the science is that they're trying to portray in these maps. So getting data and communicating with scientists. I found this to be one of the more interesting things in my research was what kind of data people in the media and at these government agencies who were disseminating data, what kind of data they were getting. And I just want to read some of these quotes because they're kind of interesting. Sometimes I'll get scientists who send me text files, one's of longitude, one's of latitude, this one's of the Western Hemisphere, this one's for one day at this time of day. Sometimes we get a binary file or a really unusual format that the scientists made up from data they collected using hardware they made. And sometimes we get PDFs, which is not ideal. So the kind of wealth of different information that scientists are creating and then gets given to media organizations is really quite diverse. Then the communication with scientists was a common theme. I kind of was under the impression that there might not be a lot of communication back and forth before I did this study. And while I was doing this, it was a constant theme that there's quite a bit of back and forth with experts. So this is Lauren Tierney again. We go back and forth with the expert to be like, hey, we took your words, shifted to this, which is still accurate, but a little more audience friendly. What do you think? And most of them like, yeah, that's great. And sometimes they're like, no, there's all this uncertainty. You need to show it. Can you please gray this out? And so trying to balance the kind of complexity of the science and do service to the scientists, as well as making something generally audience-friendly, is something that all of the participants talked about. So distilling information, this is probably the kind of meat of what I was trying to get at when I was talking to scientists. So how do they kind of make this tangible for people? So this quote's from Larry Buchanan at the New York Times. Uglier the site, better the data, general ground rule. So they look all at a lot of kind of bad maps, what we would call bad maps as cartographers, and get ideas for how they can make that better. So this is a sea surface temperature map, which has these really dark lines between the colors, and of course, probably a lot of people in this room don't like rainbow color schemes. So looking at that, and it's also very detailed, like the line work of the countries is very highly detailed. So taking that map and then maybe making something that's a little bit more accessible, the data is not quite the same, but it is of sea surface temperature. It removes those dark lines between the gradient color scheme and then makes it a diverging color scheme, which tells a story with the data in a way that the other map didn't. And then all the cartographers were really inspired by good design. Generally, a lot of them talked about how they looked at the New York Times, but they all were really impressed by the fact that I was going somewhere else. They were like, oh man, you're going to National Geographic? That's so cool. And I'm like, you work at the New York Times. So they were all, you all look at each other's stuff, and I think that's really great, and probably NACIS is a really great way in which we all come together and do that. But you're all looking at each other's work and inspired by and follow the guides of each other. So reducing complexity is a part of this is removing extraneous information. So this was Ryan Williams at National Geographic, and he said, sometimes it's a matter of forcing the hand of the expert and saying, I can only say one thing with your data, what do you want me to say with it? And then I made this legend here. It's not real data, but right, this is a kind of highly precise data, and then maybe when we talk to the general audience, that maybe we just need to know that darker is more, right? Giving that preciseness to something might not be important if that's not the kind of story you're trying to tell. So in that Harold et al. Paper, they talk a lot about inference making, and we've had a lot of great presentations this week about storytelling. So yesterday and today, some folks at the University of Wisconsin-Madison have been talking a lot about storytelling, and so I think that in mapping for the media, it's about telling stories and kind of guiding your readers through a narrative, and that way you can kind of direct them to the inferences that they need to make with the data that you're trying to show. And sometimes it's about using kind of metaphors. So Lauren Tierney talked about this map in particular yesterday because she just worked on it and was just published this summer. And in it, down in the right-hand corner, which you may or may not be able to see, I stole this from her Twitter, so it's not super high resolution, but there's a Statue of Liberty down in the bottom right-hand corner to show you what sea level rise would look like on the Statue of Liberty if Antarctica melted. So using those kind of metaphors, ways to make the data accessible. So maps abstract, that's kind of inherent in what they do, but can they also make the abstract tangible? Climate change is a very abstract, confusing thing. Even when you study it, it's very, very abstract. So one of the ways in which that I've seen that they have made climate change tangible is by not talking about climate change necessarily as this big issue, but as small issues that are a part of the bigger issue. So this map is by the New York Times and really gives you a sense of scale when, so these are flow rates in moulins in Greenland, so they're like pockets of melting ice in Greenland, and by kind of using scale in this interactive, it's making that a lot more tangible for you. And then there was a lot of talk about how maps are kind of inherently more tangible than some other graphs. So one of the quotes was, a line graph, I don't really experience a line graph, but I experience a geography. And I think whenever you communicate climate change or any kind of important story that might affect people, millions of people, it's more tangible through maps. And this is also kind of a way in which to make climate change tangible. So this is a map of sea level rise, potential sea level rise in New York City. And so by doing that kind of oblique view, really lets people feel like they've experienced this before. So all of the maps that I was looking at were kind of US focused, and a lot of US citizens have been to New York City, and they've experienced this place, and it makes it feel real to them. It gives them something that they can relate to. So something that I've learned from this research, which is that I'm doing qualitative research kind of for the first time, is that there's a lot of more questions that I could ask, and I'm really excited to kind of keep going on asking those as I kind of progress through my career. And one of the things is, are these maps that matter? So we probably think that, right? But how do we know if they're maps that matter? So I want to kind of bring your attention to this concept of vividness, which comes from the communication literature. And it's content that attracts and holds attention, it excites the imagination, it's emotionally interesting, concrete and image-provoking, proximate in a sensory, temporal, or spatial way. And it's been shown to have a strong impact on people's attitudes when the main point of communication is the sole vivid component. So this is kind of the theoretical framework that I'm using in my dissertation to, by which maybe we can measure potential impact on people's attitudes. So one part of this is the emotional interest, and so Amy and I are going to be conducting a study soon about kind of the emotional interest in some of these maps of climate change. And so I just wanted to draw your attention to this idea of vividness, and hope that I can talk to you more about it as I kind of keep fleshing out the rest of my dissertation. And with that, I just want to thank you and take any of your questions.